Maybe every scientist wonders
how to publish in high-impact journals.
High-impact journals.
Publish in high-impact journals.
Pretty much the highest impact factor journals.
Top journals.
Get published in one of these journals.
high impact or top or prestigious journals such as Nature, Science, The Lancet, Cancer Journal for Clinicians, Journal of American Medical Association, New England Journal of Medicine. They are all banks of currency for scientists. More papers the scientist gets from there, literally richer she is. Because with articles in these journals, she can get a permanent position or a funding to perform their research, or to have a great opportunity to be internationally recognized and respected. But is it worth it to sacrifice a lot of time, efforts, and public money for this journal prestige? As sometimes it can cost a lot for taxpayers' budgets and sometimes their lives. This is the last part of our interview with Bernd Brahms. My name is Stefania, and you're watching Open Science TV. It is difficult to estimate harm of Andrew Wakefield's paper published in well-known prestigious journal The Lancet. It is about the link between the use of measles, mumps, rubella or MMR vaccine and the development of autism. It was written 20 years ago, retracted 10 years ago. It is considered to be fraud, as neuroscientists failed to reproduce Wakefield's results and were concerned about ethical background of his research. British journalist Brian Deer, which performed an independent investigation, found that Wakefield has multiple conflicts of interest and had manipulated evidence. But the problem is that this retracted paper is still being cited and referenced by anti-vaxxer movement, people that deny the advantage of vaccination and find it to be dangerous. We could understand that anti-vaxxers are afraid of big pharmaceutical companies which are interested in money-making at any cost. Of course, people are free to do whatever they want, but in this case, they are certainly misguided by this fake article. How much people had refused, are refusing, and will refuse their children to be vaccinated because of Wakefield research? One of the factors responsible for the return of preventable infectious diseases in Europe is believed to be low and incomplete vaccination coverage. So could we blame The Lancet, which published this fraudulent paper responsible in millions of deaths from measles outbreaks last 20 years? If we want to choose one from two sides, we need not to be ruled by fakes. I invite you for discussion. Bjorn, what is wrong with these prestigious journals? I imagine that publishers of high-impact journals, they have a lot of money from subscriptions and other processing fees. Why do they not hire more people to control the quality of research? Why they do not invest in that? Why do they continue to publish fraudulent and flawed papers that are dangerous for society? And these journals, they even still stay prestigious for scientists.
That's a very good question. It's I can give you a very easy answer, but it's difficult to understand. The easy answer is because they don't care. They only care about money. They don't care whether what they publish is a service to science or not, or society. That's a process that Maxwell started, and that's how it's still today. The top priority for these publishers is not the accuracy of their reporting. The top priority is either if they're non-profits to stay afloat, or if it is to make a profit. Why is that difficult to explain? Because one would say that, well, you know, if a journal then only pays attention to money and not to the accuracy of their results, they would lose prestige, but they don't. So every single scandal that there is, and there is one every month probably, only some of them make it to the big news corporations, but every scandal in science is virtually every scandal comes out of the prestigious journals, but it has virtually no effect on their prestige. And this is in large part because this prestige is psychological. When a really bad article gets published in one of those journals, they go, the readers go, oh, how could this be published? This is really weird. When a bad article gets published somewhere else, they go, oh, of course, this is such a bad journal. Of course, this gets published there. But because the amount of subjectively good or bad papers varies a lot, people have confirmation bias, right? Is that, oh, there's a great article there. Of course, this is one of those top journals. Of course, they publish the great stuff. And so that's one aspect of it. Confirmation bias is one aspect of it, why prestige doesn't go down. Another aspect is that people behave in a recent survey, people behave like drivers. You know how surveys of drivers always come up with everybody thinks they're above average? Like all the bad drivers are everybody else but oneself. It's very similar with this journal prestige. There was a recent survey that showed that people say, oh no, journal prestige is not relevant for me, but everybody else, for everybody else, journal prestige is really, really important, so I have to publish in these journals. And so, of course, if this is what you think, you can even think that this journal is really bad. You will still publish there because you think everybody else judges you by publishing in these journals. So essentially, if Nature or Science would just publish false stories for a year, it would probably not have much of an effect because people still think that way. And so there isn't really a way that I can see out of this, because as long as you think, I don't care about these journals, but everybody else does, then nothing's going to change because you've already made up your mind. And if you think that everybody else is not capable of making up their minds, then nothing will change.
But in the same time, I'm on doing harm to the society by publishing bad quality papers. This prestige has an effect on scientists' mental health, which is actually difficult to ignore. Working in conditions of this psychological and artificial prestige is very hard. And there are a lot of talented scientists that left academia because of these unfair ratings.
Absolutely. And this is the third aspect, besides those psychological aspects of where to publish. This is also the third psychological aspect of how to publish. Essentially, everyone's desperate to publish in these journals. Even those people who say that, oh, I hate these journals, but I have to publish there because otherwise I have to leave science. Now, what that leads to, and this brings us right back to your question about the reliability of science in these journals, is that if you find something that is very splashy, where you say, oh, this may be something that Nature would like to publish, then you try to publish this as soon as you can. And very often this means that there are errors in your work. It means that maybe you didn't collect all your sample size to the right sample size. You find something, oh, it's significant, I'll stop measuring right there, even though you should have doubled your sample size, but it's already significant, so I stop measuring. I have my significant result, and I have something to show. I have my positive result. If I keep measuring, maybe it gets smaller, and then maybe Nature isn't interested in it anymore. I really need to publish this very quickly. And so this is really, this appears to be an important aspect, because if you quantify the errors, for instance, in journals, like in an average article, how many errors are there in there? And there's all kinds of errors. You can look at errors in Excel sheets. You can look at errors in p-values, miscalculations, these sorts of things, or in things missing from the materials and methods section. Or you look at insufficient sample sizes. If you look at all of these things, there's a lot of things you can quantify just by counting them in the articles. What you find is that these prestigious journals, not only do they publish all the scandal papers, they also publish more papers with more errors than other journals. So if you take the hierarchy of journals and you plot against that hierarchy, you plot how well have the experiments been done, then you either find, in many cases, you find no relation, though they're not better than other journals. And in some cases, you even find it goes in the other way around, is that the more prestigious the journal is, the less reliable, the less well done is the work there. And that goes from the experimental design to writing the paper. So, and in the best of cases, it's just sloppiness because you're so eager to publish this quickly that if you work fast, you make errors, right? And that's in the best of cases. In the worst of cases, it is you leave some data out, you stop measuring when you have something significant. So this ranges from just trying to be quick to all the way to scientific misconduct and everything in between. And all of this essentially makes the scientific literature in general likely more and more unreliable, because if it is the case that, and I think this is has also been shown, that you're more likely with high impact publications to retain tenure, to get funded, this means that you're also will then be in a position where you teach new early career researchers on how to succeed in science. Well, what are you going to teach them? You're going to teach, you publish high impact papers, and you do that in a way how you did it, namely, on average, by publishing unreliable research. So of course you will have, even if this aspect is only relevant for a small percentage of scientists at every given generation, it means that you have an exponential growth of these strategies. Because it may only be very few people that got a job at any given cycle, but then these few people will teach others on how to be successful. And so it multiplies. And so there have been, because people have started to realize that we may run into trouble when we keep selecting scientists for publishing unreliable research, people have been wondering, okay, and because of these scandals, of course, how reliable is the scientific literature? And there were two early groups of publications that have not been very helpful, but they have sparked a lot of interest. One group came from news reports by companies. Biomedical companies published news reports that they could only reproduce 20% of the literature. But because they didn't want to tell anybody what they were researching on, they didn't say which papers. So this got a lot of interest, but at the same time, it was completely useless because we couldn't check it. We didn't know what they were doing. Then the other group of papers, they looked at the materials and methods sections and studied, okay, were those written in a way that we can publish, that we can reproduce the publications? So, or were there critical aspects missing for whatever reason? Maybe sloppiness, maybe they've just forgot it, or maybe they didn't want anybody to reproduce what they were doing for whatever reasons. And these group of publications, they came to something like 50%, 50-60% were not reproducible, because we can't even know what we have to reproduce if it's not written down properly in the publications. So with these two groups of papers, people thought, okay, we really need to check. We really need, and with the scandals, we really need to check how reliable is our literature. And there were several of these reproducibility projects planned. I know of two that are, one is ready, one is published, and one is almost published. The first one that is fully published is 100 experiments in psychology. And smack in the middle of the predictions of these two groups of publications before, only 39 of those 100 were reproducible. So, and this, for me, if only, it's difficult to say if 39% is a lot or little. For me personally, it's science. There is some science is really difficult, and there is some error in there. But for me, if my experiments would be only 39 reproducible, I think I would quit my job. This would be horrible. But doesn't have to be the case for all of science. So this is not so trivial, but it's the estimates that the unreliability of science or the irreproducibility of science lies somewhere between, 80 or 50%. 61% is right there. The second experiment is in cancer research. They attempted to scrutinize and reproduce 50 experiments from high-profile journals, from high-impact journals. After a few years, they found out that of those 50 experiments, only 18 were technically reproducible, and that means they could even be technically started, because even with the help of the authors, the experimental details were no longer to be determined sufficiently well, or a cell line wasn't available anymore, a mouse model wasn't available anymore, anything like that. Any number of reasons, such that you couldn't even start to do that. So out of 50 high-profile experiments, only 18 could be started to reproduce. Not even half. And out of those 18, now 14 are done, and only 5 could be unambiguously reproduced. 5 out of 14. So if you take the whole 50, it's 5 out of 50. Now, there's still 4 missing, and there were some that were partially reproduced. So there's still a chance of getting in that 20%, 30% ballpark, depending on how you count it. But if you count, of course, the percentage gets higher. If you only count those 18, then 5 or 7, if you take the partial reproducibility in there, then you're close to 50%. If you count it like that, if that's how you want to count it. But if you look at what people wanted to reproduce, it was 50 experiments or 50 studies. And so far, only 5 could be reproduced. And so this is clearly a difficult sell. If you want to sell the public the case that 45 out of 50 were wasted taxpayer money, then I think this is very difficult to sell to the public. And so I think we should try to do our best, our very best, to make unambiguously clear that we are tackling, that we're aware of this problem, and we're tackling it head on. And one of the major drivers of this unreliability, one of them, it's not the only one, but one important driver, is indeed journal prestige and the pressure to publish in these journals. And this is what we're not tackling. And if we're not seen to be tackling this problem on a massive scale to eliminate the need to publish in these journals, and ideally simply by eliminating the journals, because as we've shown, the prestige doesn't go away. So the only solution that I see is to eliminate journals, use a modern system as you proposed, where we just combine our research, text, data, and code in a very easy way, much easier than the journals force us to use 1995 technology, and then publish everything openly accessible without the need for publishing in these journals. If we don't do that, I think we're going to have a very hard time selling publicly funded research to the taxpayers that are supposed to pay it. And the behavior and the publication of these articles now with COVID-19 in the Lancet and the New England Journal of Medicine don't make it easier.
However, I see that commercial journals, they are now acting in the way that everything is transparent, fair, and open. For example, if we will go to the website of Elsevier publisher, we will see that they claim they are for open science and open access, but the problem is that it is still cost a lot of money to make this openness possible, with so-called article processing charges, or APCs, which can be actually, I think, few thousands of dollars. It is a strategy with which commercial publishers are trying somehow adapt to changes in scientific communications. Or should we believe them while there is a movement against their business model?
This is actually, one can see this from several perspectives. One can see it actually as a mistake that we researchers did that had unexpected consequences. So before, let's say about 2012, 13, 14, something like this, a lot of research was behind a paywall. So it was very difficult to access. And this problem started with the advent of the internet in the early 90s. People realized, look, we could have much easier access if everything would just be online. And this is one part of what started the archive with Alan Greenspark for the physics and math communities. But it's also what started this open access movement around that time, around 1990, between 1991 and 1994. And the idea here is that, okay, everything should be much cheaper. It should be much easier to get everything published. We just publish it on the archive, let's say, and we don't need any more publishers. But as the physics community has shown, people still use the publishers. Now, outside of those archive fields, this preprint habit never caught on until recently. So this means that, for instance, for biomedical research, which is really important, it saves lives, right? Biomedical research wasn't accessible at all to a large extent until fairly recently. And so from the 1990s until 2010, and longer, so for 20, 25 years, there was this movement, we need to make it accessible. How can we make it accessible? And one idea there were several ideas. One idea, of course, was to have something very similar to archive. They called it eBiomed. This was in the early 90s as well. And it was an initiative in the NIH, but the publishers said, oh no, this is a government interfering with our businesses, and so eBiomed was shut down. And then because there were various initiatives in the 1990s to try and find a way around paywalls, and none of them really worked. And then the same people that had started eBiomed, but were shut down and not backed up by the institution, were shut down by publishers and not backed up by their institutions, they had another idea. Well, why don't we make a business that publishes, but it publishes on the net, and we just take money for publishing. So whenever you submit something, you pay a little bit, because that can't be expensive, put it on the internet, you pay a little bit, and especially in the rich countries, this is easy. A few $100s is not a lot. And then we make it public, and we can show that this can actually make money. And several initiatives did this around that time. I think the first to do this was Vitek Trach with the Biomed Central group of journals. And then very soon thereafter, it was the Public Library of Science with the same people that started or tried to run eBiomed, like Harold Varmus and the Isons and that sort of thing, and these people. It turned out that this can actually be a profitable business, and Vitek sold BMC to Springer as soon as it was running a profit. And this is when publishers started taking over these, what then people called gold open access. They called it gold because of the money, and the person who called gold and green is the person, Stephen Harnad, who also essentially kickstarted the open access movement with his Subversive Manifesto in 1994, and green being sort of like the archive way, and gold being the publisher money-paying way. Now what we see, fast forward, now what we see today is the publishers are more and more adopting the gold open access way, and they do it in a way that is very similar to the way they used subscriptions to make money. They use now the prestige that comes with their journals to ask more money for the prestigious journals and less money for the less prestigious journals. When in fact, and a lot more, so a lot more than the price differential. There is some price differential, but it's fairly small. So I mean, with price, I mean the cost that you have running a very prestigious journal, which is usually selective, and a not so prestigious journal, which is not so selective. There is a price differential there, but it's not that high. A cost differential, let me correct that. There's a cost differential there, but it's not that high. But the price differential between these journals is much, much higher than that. So essentially, you could say that they run the lower ranking, lower prestige journals with less of a profit, and then they run the high prestige journals with a lot of profit. And because scientists need to publish in those prestigious journals, we cannot go to the cheaper journals, because that would mean that we forego a lot of opportunities in our careers. And so what we have now, then, if that would turn out to be the case, we would be in a very weird situation. Because, as I said, until around 2012, 2014, we really couldn't get around paywalls. So access really was a problem. But until then, so there have been more and more technical solutions and initiatives, such as preprint archives, such as other sharing sites, such as automated paper sharing, such that as asking people on Twitter to send the article, lots of different things, and Sci-Hub, of course, a lot of different things have happened that now allow us to go around paywalls. If there is a paywall, there's always there's a dozen different ways of getting an article. And one of them will work. So which means that since for the last, 5, 6, 7 years now, there has been no access problem anymore. But this is also, the access now is not only, it has become irrelevant, but the publishers are already making money with it. So now what we then have is, before 2012, we had the problem that we couldn't read certain articles, and it was difficult to get them. You could still get them, but it was difficult. Now it's easy to get the articles, but it's difficult for reading, but it's difficult to write because you need money. So essentially we have the same problem. Again, we have a paywall, but now the money isn't preventing us from reading important research. It prevents us from writing, from publishing the research. Now, as I said, there are workarounds to get to an article that's under a subscription. It's easy now. It's more difficult before 2012, but it was also possible. There were workarounds. Paywall, you can work around. It may be difficult, especially before 2012 it was difficult, but it was possible. There is a workaround. There are workarounds, at least if there aren't any at any given point in time. You can imagine that there can be a technological solution in the future that if an article is published, that I can access it. But if it's not published, it means that the research isn't even out there. So now we don't have a paywall that we can go around. We have a paywall that there's no way around. And that paywall is even worse now than the old paywall, because it means that now the rich countries dominate everything much more, because the poor people that cannot publish in the top journals, they don't have a voice at all. So essentially what has happened is that we had a problem in the 1990s, and we tried to solve it without taking into account the potential consequences and without taking into account all the other aspects, for instance, prestige and the competition between researchers And so there are a bunch of aspects to this whole problem of digital infrastructure that the people, and I include myself there, I have to say, that the people that the people in the 1990s and then later in the early 2000s, they didn't realize that changing or solving this one problem can lead to a bigger problem on the other side. And so that's why today there is no open access problem anymore. On the contrary, the solutions that we have pose bigger problems than the problem that we have to begin with. There's a German word for it. It's called Verschlimmbesserung. It means making things worse by trying to make them better. And this is what is happening. It's not complete yet, but we're on a trajectory that goes in this direction. And so what is important here then is that when one wants to fix this, one has to take all of these aspects into account and not say that, okay, we'll fix access and worry about the other problems later, because it may well be that we run into a dead end where we can't get out. This is, we fix this one thing and we'll worry about things later, is what people also did in the 90s. One of the reasons why, besides the internet, the other reason why we had such trouble with access is because libraries were forced into big deals. A big deal means that you subscribe or buy all journal articles from a publisher. So let's say one library goes to a publisher and says, look, we only want to have all the fields that are not on archive. So let's say biology, law, economics, and medicine. But math and physics we won't pay, because we have it on archive. Our faculty, they don't need that. Then the publisher will say, oh, but this makes our handling of your IP addresses for access much more complicated. You will have to pay more to get less articles. And so if you just buy all of our articles, it'll be cheaper. So why don't you do that? And so that means that you're locked into this system where you don't want the math and physics journals, but you pay for them anyway because it's cheaper. And then what the publishers have been doing is they say, okay, but next year it's going to be 10% more expensive. But because you're such an important customer, we'll only make it 5% more expensive just for you, as long as you don't tell anybody how much you paid. So that's what they have done. And so essentially for all of the 1990s and 2000s, they have had 2 or 3 times the inflation in terms of price increase, because the libraries weren't allowed to say how much they paid. And the publishers, with all that money that they had, they bought the best negotiators that you can buy, and they pitted them against librarians. That's not an equal match. That's not fair. These negotiators are highly skilled, trained people that just manipulate librarians like puppets.
This is truly terrible to learn about how much the scientific prestige is doing damage to the research process. But could it be that that problem that open science and open access activists, they were not united together to estimate the risks of their initiatives? Maybe while they were thinking in different directions, and that is how it didn't work in the end.
For 30 years, the initiative has always come from people who are not infrastructure experts, right? So we try all kinds of things and hoping it will work out. And this is how Gold Open Access was started. This is how our initiative was started. We just try things out, and we don't know what works because we're not experts, right? I'm a neuroscientist. I don't work in infrastructure, right? What should have happened is that computing centers and libraries in the 1990s think, okay, how can we use the internet to serve our faculty best? And in the early 1990s, that's what they did. They said, oh, there's this new thing, internet. Let's pull cables. Let's install routers. This is fascinating. And you have FTP servers, and they have Gopher, and then you have NCSA Mosaic, the first browser. and you could browse the internet, and you had email, and all of this happened. And every new development, like I remember MBone, multicast backbone. Have you heard of MBone? It was, you could see, it was in 1994, 95 or something like this. You could watch TV over the internet because universities would pipe their TV signal into this multicast backbone just to try the technology. All of this happened, and then it stopped. And to this day, I wonder why it stopped. Essentially, the universities with small differences at the margins, but in the big core, the services that we get from the university are the same that we got in 1995. It's as if the last 25 years never happened. Only now, with the corona pandemic, all of a sudden, when we're forced to be at home and when we have to use for certain things digital infrastructure, then all of a sudden, some of these things happen. And so, for instance, we got we got a Zoom account, and we got right here, and our university, and we have a solution, a GitLab account, a solution for our scientific code, and things like that. But for 25 years, there was essentially nothing.
So maybe during COVID-19 crisis, it is actually a good time for academia. Of course, despite hundreds of thousands victims, it's good time to have this opportunity for science to be transformed, to be open.
Yes, and I would hope that people who are experts in this, not me, but people who know what they're doing, the people in the computing centers and in the libraries, finally now 25 years later, almost 30 years later, come up with solutions that do not make things worse. And because, I mean, we pay the publishers. And like I said, our library, and I'm on the library committee, and still I cannot get the library because I'm only one person on the committee. I cannot get the library committee for various reasons to stop paying these subscriptions. Even though, and that's the funniest thing, even though I think there would be a majority, but there are other reasons, particularly in Germany with the deal negotiations, there are other reasons. Even if now we all agree that we don't need subscriptions anymore, there are, we have signed up to this deal process, for instance, here in Germany, that it's very difficult politically to back out. So by now, I think very few people in our library support the deal contracts. We support the sentiment and the idea of deal, but the contracts we're very unhappy with. But we want to show the solidarity with the other libraries in Germany, and so we suck it up and we pay anyway. So there's various reasons why we're sort of stuck, also locally. But I would hope that this fragmentation of initiatives where non-experts come up with solutions, I would hope that this would slowly come to an end, not because the ideas are bad. The solutions that we had are not all bad, and many of them are excellent, and many of them provide solutions for small isolated problems. They're great. I know people who have left academia and founded companies, successful companies on such solutions. So I think it isn't time to sort of stop that, but what I think it is time is that the infrastructure experts at our institutions worldwide coordinate to come up with a solution that gets rid of all these issues that we had with our text, data, and code that we talked about now in the last hour and a half. In a way that is sustainable, also in the long term, that provides this infrastructure that supports reliable research, that's affordable, and provides us with all these missing functionalities that we've been asking for the last 25 years. Right? So those are the three most important things, I think, for our infrastructure right now. It's a reliability, an infrastructure that supports reliability in science, that's affordable for everyone, not just for the rich countries and the rich institutions, and that provides us with functionalities that allows us to take advantage of the technology that there is out there. And once we have a system that has all three, it will automatically be open, because open is good for science. So
thank you a lot, Björn, for this productive conversation. I learned myself a lot of things about scientific communication, and I hope our viewers did the same. Thank you for being active and brave in open science movement for so long. I really hope that while we talk about problems in academia and turn public attention, we can get our science finally open. So I would like to ask you, our viewer, to support our Open Science TV project, to like, comment, to share this video among your friends, family, and colleagues. Also, subscribe to our YouTube channel and social media accounts, because there will be another crisis after COVID-19, and only science which is done in the right way can deal with. So I think the science which is well managed, open, and without the commercial interest. So thank you a lot. See you soon. Bye.